The lacquered coffee table caught the night like a dark pool, mirror smooth under the chandelier. Outside, the rain had begun in a hush, a silvered veil that blurred the skyline into watercolor. Inside, the apartment breathed with its usual careful calm, the low pulse of the aquarium, the soft tick of a handmade clock, the faint smell of bergamot that always lingered after guests. Evelyn Hart moved among those small certainties with the same practiced ease she brought to every gala and charity luncheon, an ease that had been polished into habit over years of being seen and saying the right thing. She wore a green coat that matched the jade ring she never took off, a thin circle of stone snug around the third finger that had belonged to her grandmother. To others it was an accessory. To Evelyn, it was a tiny private faith. She noticed things, a crease in a napkin, the way a conversation paused near a painting. It was easy to mistake her life of appearances for flightiness. The truth was quieter. She catalogued people the way she catalogued art, not with exacting charts, but with an intuition that linked faces to motives, gestures to words unsaid. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had built a parallel life in glass and steel. He was CEO of Hale Maritime, a company named for the family and run, at least in public, like a dynasty. Their home and his boardroom acknowledged the same aesthetic: clean lines, curated objects, a refusal of clutter. Thomas carried certainty like an invisible coat. Evelyn loved that certainty once, for the safety it offered. Lately she had begun to notice its seams. The first time the house seemed to breathe secrets was the night of the charity ball. They had returned late, tired from smiles and cameras. Thomas had kissed her the way he did when the world watched, firm, rehearsed, and retreated to his study to end the night with the quiet obsession of a man who measured himself in spreadsheets and signed papers that reshaped other people's lives. Evelyn made tea, changed into a robe, and paused by his office door. There was a folded napkin on the desk where his glass sat, an odd thing in a room that otherwise taught restraint. She laid a hand on the frosted glass of the door as if testing a temperature, and for a blink, the house seemed to exhale. She opened the desk drawer later in the night to retrieve an old photograph of them on a trip. Just a domestic errand in a life that held more public spectacles than private ones. Her fingers brushed against a slim metal object hidden behind a stack of legal pads, a small encrypted flash drive with no label, tucked as if slipped into hiding. The room narrowed to the ring of jade in her hand, and the dull weight of the drive. The discovery felt obscene and intimate at once. Inside her home, she had found something that suggested the life she thought she knew could be rearranged by a single object. Her reaction was immediate, a cyclone of instinct, shock, a flaring hurt, a steadiness that was almost ceremony. She could walk into Thomas's study, open his laptop, confront him, make the breach public in one blow. Or she could let the thing sit like an accusation and sleep on it, letting it rot into doubt. What flared most was not curiosity alone, but the question that had already begun to take shape in her mind. Was this a personal betrayal or something larger? Who used her husband's privacy as a hiding place, and why? When Thomas found her at the study door, she was holding the drive like evidence at a trial. He didn't shout. He had learned that theatricality belonged in the headlines, and had, perhaps, stopped recognizing urgency when it knocked on their private rooms. His face, in the warm lamplight, was a sculpture of control strained. He reached for the drive with a hand that trembled only slightly. "What is that?" she asked. He hesitated, which was the only admission she needed to know something was wrong. Evelyn, I can explain." "Explain what? Why you hide things in our home? Why we'd—" It was a small confrontation, domestic in its proportions, yet seismic to Evelyn. Thomas gathered his composure, offered a practiced calm that was all too familiar in boardrooms. "It's complicated. This is corporate. If I saw, and it was illegal," she finished for him. Her voice was not harsh. It was a blade dulled by disbelief. "If this is about money, about the company, then it's not corporate. It is ours." He flinched. His instinct was to protect the company the way he protected a family heirloom. First contain, then manage. "There are things you don't understand, Evie." "Oh, I understand," she said. The name felt both intimate and sharp. "I understand loyalty. I understand legacy. I understand what it means to keep a family name unsullied. But I also understand trust. If you think hiding a drive under your own pen, is the proper way to handle something that could destroy people. Then I'm done listening to pieties. They stood in the study, the rain punctuating the air like a metronome. Thomas's defense folded and reassembled like paper. There's a family matter involved, he admitted finally. Graham. Graham, she echoed. That name carried weight. Thomas's cousin, a man who moved through the family with an appetite that had been tempered, not punished. Evelyn heard the rest in the way Thomas said it. He was half apologizing to a lineage. You hid it because of him, she said. The sentence was a verdict she did not want to deliver. The first block had done its work. The discovery had been made inside the house, the promise of the title fulfilled, and the veneer of certainty cracked. Evelyn felt like a collector who had found a forgery in a private vault. It would be easy to let outrage do all the work. She did not. She had a kind of empathy that put danger under a microscope. She could feel the ache beneath Thomas's stubbornness, and still see the harm. If this is gripping you, follow to see how she proves it wasn't just a rumor. She slept poorly. Not out of anxiety alone, but because the flash drive kept sitting in the corner of her mind like a jewel that might cut. In the gray that preluded dawn, she remembered an old favor. Park Jin, a man who had once been in charge of logistics at the harbor, now retired quietly but with a ledger of contacts and a distaste for laundering. Park Jin had been helpful, discreet, a reliable ally to those who needed the cogs of shipping turned honestly. Evelyn texted him under the pretense of asking about a philanthropic container of art that had been delayed months ago. He replied with an economy of concern. Come by the pier. Coffee, 2 a.m. I'll bring files. Before she left that night, she did the only thing she could do without violating legal or ethical boundaries. She made a copy on her own computer of the drive's index. The folder names were sparse, intentionally nondescript. Invoices, 2019. Logistics, conf, seal reports. There was one file named Manifest Reconcile, with a timestamp that didn't match the printed dates on the invoice she recognized from last year. That mismatch became the first thin thread she would tug. Park Jin smelled of tobacco and lemon when she met him at the sleepy cafe by the docks. The port's activity at that hour was a low, indifferent roar. Cranes like sleeping skeletons, containers stacked like muted stories. He looked at her with the sort of steady gaze that had once calmed 1,000 anxious clients. She showed him the file names, described the drive, and did not lie about how she had found it. Spouses of men who run companies find things, Park Jin said finally. The sentence had no malice, only recognition. Sometimes they are accidents, sometimes they are truth. Either way, you have one advantage. You have access. We can make that work. He agreed to check the manifests and the logs from the port servers he still had good contacts with. But he warned her, if this was crossing into illicit territory, they would need corroboration, videos, bank transfers, and evidence of tampered seals. Lockers, he said, using the Portuguese term that felt like another language of shipping. If someone breaks the seal and records it as intact, you'll see the sign. The trick is matching timestamps and receipts. The private investigation opened like a wound and like a diary. Evelyn recruited small, trusted people, each with a careful role. There was Lena Ortiz, an independent cyber specialist with soft hands and sharp eyes who could coax encrypted drives into cooperation without leaving a trace that would make a prosecutor grimace. There was Ari March, a journalist friend who had once written an exposé on corporate negligence and wasn't afraid of the consequences, partly because she had learned how to prepare for them. Park Jin worked the port channels. Evelyn's intuition came in half flashes. An idea that a night's CCTV might show a crate detouring through a secondary gate. A memory of Graham's name cropping up in casual mentions at family dinners. The ineffable feeling that the jade ring had grown heavier with each secret they kept. She never treated those intimations as proof. They were paths, not destinations. She followed them like a thread through fabric. They found the first solid thing 2 weeks into their private search. Park Jin called on a rain-splattered morning. We have footage, he said. Dock 7, second shift 3 months ago. The manifest lists sealed containers leaving at 9. The camera shows a truck coming at 10 with the same plate. The stamp time on the manifest is 9:30. Someone adjusted the report. Someone with access. Lena worked on the drive and surfaced an email thread that at first read like corporate jargon. terms about reconciliations, client holds, special manifests. But under the jargon, there were names. Graham's name. A payment chain that led not to a corporation, but to a set of shell companies with no operational history, and a finishing note. Cover costs. Protect family. Evelyn read those emails at her kitchen table with the rain a soft applause outside. The jade on her finger seemed to anchor her. The word protect had the double taste of devotion and rot. She confronted Thomas again, this time with more than a glare and a question. She had evidence she could show without making a spectacle. She had a map of the hole and the people who tended it. In the study, she set the drive and a printed screenshot of port footage on the table between them like small claims. He watched the images and did not look away. His face was an odd mix of resignation and calculation. "You never asked questions, Evie," he said. The tone was not an accusation, but an explanation of why things had been possible. "You were always the face." "I asked you," she said. "You answered with PR and speeches and then retreated into numbers. Did you think I wouldn't notice the seam? Or did you think I would never step across it?" He touched the jade ring when she looked at him. The gesture was mechanical, like someone thinking aloud. "I thought I could keep the family together if you kept lying," she finished. The words were cold. "If you thought that hiding things beneath your name, underneath this roof, would keep anyone safe?" He did not answer. There was a long stretch of air where only the clock marked time. The house felt exposed suddenly, every wall a witness. Evelyn understood then that his defense was not simply about protecting the company. It was about the fragile architecture of a family whose power had always seemed invulnerable. The betrayal was not only corrupting money, it was eroding the foundation they had built together. The next stage was to turn the files into proof that could not be dismissed as a domestic spat. They needed 3 concrete things: the video showing the mismatch of seals and timestamps, an email chain explicitly linking Graham to shell companies, and the bank transfers that followed the manifests. Paper trails that could be traced, frozen, and presented. Gathering those took strategy and patience. Lena decrypted portions of the drive and found a hidden folder labeled NADA, hidden, its contents encrypted by a key that matched a password Thomas had used for work and, infuriatingly, sometimes his phone's backup. On a day when sunlight hit the kitchen counter, 2 files emerged. A video labeled Doc 7-1030, MP4, and a scanned copy of a letter with a header of Hale Maritime Procurement that had been altered. The margins showing signs of manipulation as if someone had pieced the pages together from different drafts. Park Jin tracked down a port foreman who had a grudge and a conscience. The man remembered being told to mark certain containers as priority, while they were diverted to a lot that processed third-party shipments. He had a photo on his phone taken that night of a truck leaving under a tarp. The plate in the photo matched a vehicle registered to a logistics broker known to be associated with Graham's shell companies. Ari prepared a cautious media plan, not to fan the flames, but to be ready if the story leaked. They did not want a trial by tabloids. They wanted a process that would force the company into accountability. Evelyn's instinct, the one that linked a face in a crowd to motive, told her this would not be enough alone. She needed Thomas to stand, not as a man crushed, but as someone capable of initiating the firms of reparation that the company would require. That would demand public truth. Their private investigation collided with family life in the oddest moments, during grocery runs, in quick exchanges at a school fundraiser where Evelyn fought to wear her normal smile while harboring the knowledge of fraud and manufactured timestamps. At night, they argued more than they had in years, and sometimes they slept in different rooms. The house, once a perfect stage, became a field of skirmishes and small, tender acts. Coffee left by the bed, notes slid under doors. She loved him in the complicated way of someone who had watched the man make and break things, the company, their plans, and still recognized, in the quiet, the reasons she'd fallen in love. Thomas, for his part, oscillated between contrition and silence. He was not defenseless. He had shields fashioned by power and family loyalty. He admitted to lapses of judgment, to allowing Graham greater leeway than was wise, to rationalizing transactions as strategic. But he resisted the idea of active involvement in fraud. "I didn't sign off on shell companies," he said. "I didn't order seals to be broken." Yet the proof continued to mount. Lena uncovered a pattern of emails in which Thomas's assistant had forwarded reconciled manifests with a single line added in Graham's handwriting. Confirmation that certain crates were to be rerouted. The handwriting was not definitive proof, but it placed Graham's signature across the paper. The bank records implicated accounts with the same names Graham used for real estate deals offshore. As the evidence coalesced, so did the forces arrayed to defend the status quo. Thomas's mother called Evelyn, speaking in tones of disappointment and warning. Investors began to whisper, their murmurs threading through meetings like a small pestilence. The company, always proud of its steadiness, showed the first signs of fragility when market analysts sent cautious queries. Someone in the executive suite tried to sabotage their efforts. A legal notice arrived, unspecific, menacing, threatening action if private data was disclosed. It was typed to intimidate, not to inform. Evelyn kept a copy and laughed softly at the breathiness of the threat. She did not want to escalate recklessly. She wanted a process. She had learned that justice required more than outrage. It required patience and the right sequence of exposure. One night, the argument at home grew sharp enough that the house felt split in its sympathies. Thomas accused her of making a spectacle of the family. "You knew what this could do," he said. "You tilted the balance." "I didn't start this," Evelyn replied. "I found something. I tried to let it die in secret, and it grew. The people who paid the price were not meant to be the ones who could ignore it. I can't live under the illusion that silence preserves us. Silence has hollowed out this family for years." She thought of the port workers who had little leverage and the vendors who had been squeezed. The betrayal she felt was many-layered. Against her personally, yes, but also against the idea that their family business could be a thing that cared for people. She had to choose whether to protect an image or to pursue a truth that might cost everything. The board convened in whispers first, and then in formal letters. Thomas, pushed by advisors and by his own conscience, started talks with an outside compliance auditor. That move precipitated the climax 2 months after Evelyn found the drive. The annual shareholder meeting was scheduled with its polished veneers, coffee, reports, quarterly figures, but underneath it was the pressure cooker of power and secret histories. On the morning of the meeting, Evelyn found him in the kitchen, quieter than he'd been for weeks. The jade ring caught the light as he poured coffee with a hand that bore the slight tremor of someone who had been awake through many sleepless reckonings. "Are you sure?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time the distance between the man who commanded markets and the husband she loved collapsed into a single visible thing. "No," he said. "But yes, if this is going to be fixed, we cannot do it from behind closed doors." They moved through the day like people walking into a storm in formal wear. The boardroom had been set up for projection. Ari had arranged the presence of a neutral auditor with authority and a legal team prepared for disclosure. The evidence was presented meticulously. The port video showing containers being rerouted, the decrypted emails that tied the shell companies to Graham's communications, the bank transfers that followed the altered manifests. There were timestamps, faces, and a trail of money that could no longer be explained away as a clerical error. The most damning moment was a clip, an unremarkable 5-second video of a driver placing a crate onto a truck, and in the background, a man unmistakable by his gait and haircut intercepting a handheld device, scanning the seal as intact, despite footage clearly showing the seal being reapplied. The man was Graham. The clip was not an interpretation. It was a factual record of a small bureaucratic motion that carried enormous consequence. Graham's denial was theatrical and raw. He stood in the room where his cousin had once raised him and accused the world of conspiracy. The board listened with expressions that shifted from shock to anger to sweaty calculation. People with money and influence found their voices in the language of prudence and protection. The auditors read passages aloud, and the company's counsel excused, explained, and then admitted to failures and oversight. The legal net tightened. Search warrants were served. 3 arrests followed within days. Graham and 2 of his closest associates were taken into custody for fraud and conspiracy. The company opened an internal investigation and called for external auditors to rework compliance policies. Investors demanded changes. Regulatory bodies issued notices. The consequences were not swift closure, but a slow, methodical unraveling of cover-ups and the creation of new systems that would, at least formally, prevent a similar scheme. Thomas was not arrested. He was asked to step aside as CEO while the company cooperated fully with authorities. That was a legal distinction, but not a moral absolution. In the press, he was framed variously as a victim of family betrayal and as a negligent leader. Evelyn watched the headlines with a sick knowledge that truth was often refracted differently through different lenses. In the quiet that followed the public unmasking, the toughest work began in private. Evelyn and Thomas did not pretend that everything could be restored by a statement or a press conference. Reconciliation required more than regret. It required concrete acts that acknowledged harm and committed to change. They started with deeds, small enough to be believable, and large enough to matter. Thomas resigned his executive duties and agreed to cooperate with investigators. He opened his emails and scheduled an independent audit, not only of company books, but of the practices that had allowed a family member to wield undue power. He made public a pledge, not a promise of redemption, but a clause of accountability. He would not obstruct investigations and would pursue corporate reform. At home, he did something no press release could report. He wrote letters to some of the vendors and community partners who had been on the receiving end of Graham's manipulations and asked to meet them privately. He listened. He extended restitution where it could be made directly. He apologized to employees who had been coerced into silence. That was not theatrics. It was restitution that cost something of his pride. For Evelyn, repair was not a clean arc. She demanded transparency, not absolution. She wanted to rebuild a marriage that had been marred by secrecy. She wanted a partner who would choose her and truth over convenience. They entered counseling and had many conversations that were not cinematic but were necessary. About how power had shaped their decisions, about the quiet ways men and women in their circle accommodated abuse, about the subtle bargains struck to preserve image at the expense of integrity. Her empathy kept working, but differently now. The flashes that had once been an instinctive map became a discipline that guided her steps in rebuilding the company and the home. She insisted on measures at Hale Maritime, a monitored chain of custody for manifests, independent audits at the port level, a confidential hotline for employees. Park Jin and Lena were consulted for their expertise, he to reform port procedures and she to establish secure protocols for data. Ari used her platform to cover the story with nuance, resisting the easy angles of scandal. There were personal moments that stitched the ragged edges of their life back together. Small acts, Thomas leaving a thermos of coffee on the kitchen counter with a note, Evelyn attending a town hall meeting at the company and listening to the staff speak, were small testimonies to the slow work of trust. The jade ring remained on Evelyn's finger. Sometimes she would touch it and remember the night it had acted as an anchor. Once, in a gesture that surprised both of them, Thomas took her hand and laid his free hand over the ring, a silent promise that the complicated history of their family wouldn't be hidden under dazzle again. They did not return to their previous life. The home remained a place that bore the memory of betrayal. The study had once been a sealed room where decisions were made and secrets forged. They repainted it a gentler color, filled it with books that were not only about business, but about ethics and community. They began hosting small conversations with employees and community partners, occasions where the power to speak belonged not to the familiar few, but to many. Graham's trial unfolded over months and was messy, as such things are. Evidence stood up in court. Witnesses spoke of coercion and fear. He insisted on innocence in certain aspects but was convicted on several counts. The legal consequences did not bring a neat sense of closure. They did, however, create a framework in which the company could attempt to rebuild its integrity. The aftermath was not all heavy. There were moments of surprising tenderness. A board member who had once preferred formality now confessed in a soft voice to Evelyn that he had been proud of her when she held fast. A young logistics coordinator hugged Park Jin in the hallway and said, "Thank you for not letting them ride over us." These were small tokens, but they mattered. Months later, under a canopy of early cherry blossoms in the courtyard of their home, soft pink petals drifting like a blush, Evelyn and Thomas walked slowly among the trees. The garden had been a place where she had once curated gatherings, and he had given little speeches about resilience. Now they walked with a different cadence. A child on a near bench chased petals and laughed, an ordinary sound that felt like a small miracle after so much turmoil. Evelyn carried the jade ring as always. At one point she stopped and looked at Thomas. "We can rebuild," she said, "but it can't be a way back to what we had. It needs to be a way forward, different." He nodded, folding his hand around hers. I know, he answered. This has been the hardest lesson of my life. They did not exchange vows anew or create a tableau of perfected family. Instead, they worked. Thomas stepped into a different role, one that involved more oversight and less unchecked power. Evelyn became active in the governance of the company, advocating for transparency initiatives and supporting workers at the port she had once only seen as a backdrop to charity photos. They both faced the fact that trust is built, slowly and often, with friction. Before the crisis, the house had been a stage. After it, the house became a workshop. They repaired fractures. Some required public action, some private conversation. They learned to argue without weaponizing past mistakes, and to share their vulnerabilities without turning them into leverage. They instituted checks and balances at home. Open records of certain company dealings accessible to an independent trustee, a family council with a neutral facilitator. It was not romantic. It was responsible. In quiet evenings, Evelyn would sometimes go to the study and sit with the artifacts of the case. Printouts of emails, a framed photograph of the port where workers now had more rights, a ledger that had been corrected. She kept the flash drive in a locked box only because they were required by investigators to preserve evidence, but the daily proof of change was more mundane. An employee who now had a permanent contract, a vendor who had been paid restitution, a new code of conduct displayed in the lobby. When the dust settled enough for an epilogue, it was not a cinematic reconciliation with dramatic music. It was a small domestic scene. Evelyn in the kitchen preparing coffee. Thomas bringing in 2 cups, their voices soft, their gestures ordinary. The jade ring caught the morning light as a cherry blossom petal stuck to the rim of a mug. They had weathered the catastrophe and made choices, legal, moral, personal, that carried cost. The family name had been tamed by transparency rather than preserved by secrecy. At night, Evelyn sometimes thought of the exact instant she had found the drive behind the legal pads, the way the house had held its breath. That moment, which had at first felt like an accusation, had become the hinge upon which an entire structure changed. Inside her own home she had discovered betrayal. Inside her own choices she had discovered the capacity to seek redress, and to insist that trust be earned again. The question that lingered, the one she asked herself often, was not whether she would stay. It was whether both of them would choose the hard work required to rebuild. Their answer came gradually, not as a single gesture, but as a series of small, consistent acts: transparency in meetings, restitution to those harmed, structural reform, and the willingness to be held accountable. On a late spring afternoon, as cherry blossoms fell like a soft rain, Evelyn walked the garden with Park Jin and Lena, 2 people who had helped pull threads until a pattern emerged. They watched a young dock worker point out a new public board at the company's warehouse. A roster of ethics, a place where complaints could be lodged safely. He waved, and Evelyn waved back with a tight, bright smile that felt earned. When she returned inside, she found a letter from a vendor who had been harmed. A short note that said, simply, "Thank you for listening." She held it to her chest and thought of permanence in the small things. A handwritten note, a child's laugh, a petal gilded by sunlight. The jade ring, warm on her finger, felt like a private promise. Their life was quieter now and more honest. The house still held shadows of what had happened, but its rooms now bore the marks of repair and stubborn care. Evelyn understood that trust was not a single monument to be erected and never revisited. It was, instead, a living thing that required tending, rituals of truth, and the occasional bravery to expose secrets to daylight. Certain details remained: a press release declaring the company's reform plan, a courthouse docket, a framed photo of the port where a few faces were newly recognized as people with agency, rather than as background scenery. Evelyn had learned that discovery could be a violent thing and a salvific one at once. The betrayal in their home had been a wound. The work afterward had been medicine and labor combined. She often thought, in rare stillness, about the way the house had exhaled the secret into her lap, like an animal revealing a hidden litter. That exhalation had seeded the difficult but necessary unmaking of a comfortable myth, that the family name precluded accountability. It had also, unexpectedly, revealed a new landscape for the life they could try to build. Less seamless, more honest. The story did not end with perfect harmony. There were penalties, there were long hearings, and there were days when mistrust still hovered like winter fog. Yet there were also moments of ordinary grace that slowly became the scaffolding of a renewed life. Thomas sitting in a town hall answering difficult questions. Evelyn mentoring young women in governance. Park Jin teaching a new class at the harbor about secure manifests. Lena setting up permanent cybersecurity for the company. The 3 pieces of proof, video, emails, and bank transfers, had torn the cover off a corrupt seam. The consequences were real. The work to fix what had been broken required ongoing commitment. In a final scene that was small and therefore true, Evelyn and Thomas sat on their balcony as the last petals of the cherry trees drifted to the sidewalk. They watched a neighbor close their shop and a child chase a fallen blossom. Thomas reached for Evelyn's hand without drama, their fingers interlacing the way they had in the early days of their marriage. Less possessive now, more present. "You found the courage to look," he said quietly. "And you found the courage to let people in," she replied. They did not promise a return to the past. They promised instead to choose, daily, the transparency and the hard work required to be worthy of trust. The jade ring glinted in the late light, a small green oath. The house, once the scene of betrayal, had become the place where repair was possible. Not easy, not clean, but real. If this story left you thinking of a particular moment, tell us which one moved you most, and consider subscribing for more tales that explore the fragile, complicated work of rebuilding trust.